Another conflict we had was about sort of Eastern establishment and Western. Now, what does that mean? In the United States, the Eastern establishment is more of the proper place.
The whole Eastern establishment Ivy League deal.
Yeah, so that's where the fancy schools are, the Ivy League schools. West is where the slobs are, you know. And I had left being an analyst, and I wouldn't call myself a slob, but I was pretty close. And I'm proud of it.
Relaxed.
I was very relaxed.
Proud and relaxed.
I didn't own a suit anymore. I think I had one sport jacket. I wore Birkenstocks. My hair was out like this, you know. It was those years, you remember. Now, the conflict that came up was that Sidra had a very strong feeling about her older girls, the two older girls, going to an Ivy League college. Now, we had both come out of, marriages, and we did not have much money, and we were working very, very hard. And she really had this absolute commitment to sending the girls to Eastern school. It made no sense to me because, my kids went to Western schools, and I went to a Western school, and what's the big deal? And this was really a bone of contention. Here, it wasn't like the money. I mean, money was a little bit of an issue, but the real issue was this demand on her part that this is what they needed and this is what she was going to give them. And one time
and a real feeling that one was superior to the other. I was really identified with the superiority of the East Coast.
Yes, she was.
Yeah.
But I was identified with the superiority of the West Coast. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, I said to her one time, I said, "What would you do if you weren't married to me?" I mean, we had we made a lot of money. There was the two of us. I said, "What would you do if you were alone and you didn't have somebody like me with you? And what would you do about Eastern colleges?" And she looked at me right in the eyes and she said, "I would sell my house." And I screamed at her. I said, "You are insane. You cannot mean what you're saying." And she said, "Absolutely. I would sell my house and I'd make sure that they got the kind of education." Well, that's where we were. I mean, it was crazy.
A little bit opposite.
Okay, so the form of the bonding pattern. I was in the judgmental father.
He was the judgmental father.
Underneath was, of course, the vulnerable son, which saw this burden going on for 2,000 years, you know. And incidentally, their father was paying half the Eastern thing, but half an Eastern college is still a lot of money.
Still more than one Western.
Okay. So I was in judgmental father. Underneath, of course, was vulnerable son, which is always there, but what she got from me was attacking judgmental father.
So it was kind of frightened, vulnerable son, judgmental father. I was in full-on stubborn daughter and judgmental mother, because I was judging him for wanting to make my daughters do something less than marvelous. And I was judging, and my vulnerability underneath on that one, my vulnerability was that I had gotten a divorce and I wanted my daughters to have all the advantages that they would have had if I hadn't gotten a divorce. And so it was a very, very deep mother's vulnerability.
But the amazing thing is that when you're in these bonding patterns and you're pushing off in primary selves, vulnerability doesn't come out.
You're just mad at the other person. You don't feel that part of it.
You see, if she could come to me at a time like that and say, "Look, I've divorced my husband, and I just feel that the girls have to have the chance that they would have had with their husband," I wouldn't have reacted. You see what I mean? There wouldn't have been a bonding pattern. But that's why I say that if you get in touch with that underlying vulnerability, the bonding pattern issue dissolves.
Because the other person can really hear that. If I'm busy judging him and hollering at him for being some kind of California hippie type, or he's hollering at me for being some sort of snooty, snobby Easterner, we're missing what's really going on.
Okay, so the primary self that I had to unhook from was my Western psychology, and she had to unhook from the Eastern psychology. I had to embrace my Eastern establishment.
And I had to embrace my Berkeley babe and really separate from my Eastern establishment, who was really a snob. It was really basically a snob, and I can remember waking up shortly after that one night and walking through the house and literally looking at me and my kids and the whole Eastern establishment from with a different pair of eyes, and seeing the qualities in it that weren't so good. Not a critic attack, but just literally looking at that with a different set of eyes, that there was a real snobbishness to it, and that wasn't such a good thing. I'd been very proud of the snobbishness before that. And the thing that happened was, as we integrated the opposites, the two older girls went to the Eastern schools that really belonged to them, and it was fine with Hal. And the third one chose Berkeley and stayed on the West Coast, which was really what was perfect for her. But it gives you the feeling of how, with your children, if you've got both sides available, the kids can make an appropriate choice for themselves. If you're totally identified with one side or the other, they have to go where you want them to go, or rebel and go the opposite way.
And with the younger one, I would have been delighted to send her to an Eastern school. I mean, I had reached the point where I understood the fineness of a certain kind of education that I had been cut off from. And I would have made any sacrifice to see that she went there. It would have been fine with me, up to a point. Sidra is a very proper eater, and her daughters are proper eaters. You know, I mean, they're trained differently. And I'm a fast eater, and food has a way of finding its way onto the ceiling and God knows what. So anyhow, we start to have dinner, and this would go on with Sidra alone, and sometimes with her children there, who are very slow. I'm a fast eater. And I'm fine at first, and we start eating, and then Sidra would sort of start to slow down and, you know, cut her fish, you know, slowly and slower, and her daughters would start to cut their food slower and slower, and I would go faster and faster, and it was like magic. From an adult, grown-up human being, you know what I mean, with all kinds of sophistication, I became an absolute childlike klutz that felt 2 years old and entirely the victim of this matriarchal group that was sitting in front of me on the table. And she went into her
disapproving mother.
And that was a wonderful bonding pattern. I mean, we had some wild times with that, really wild times with that before we got out of it.
So the bonding patterns force each party, if they're not resolved, further into them, deeply polarizing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
They get deeper and deeper and more desperate, because if you think of it, if you try to get out of it, who's talking is the self that's involved in the bonding pattern. So if I'm trying to discuss his klutz son from a disapproving mother, he's just...
So I have to defend myself. So I'm going to attack her and say, you know, you're just so tight and you're so matriarchal, and why don't you loosen up? I mean, so I'm going to defend myself and I'm going to be on the attack. But what is it I'm attacking? What am I judging? My disowned self.
This is a bonding pattern that happened in the past when we used to come home from trips. You know, we come home from trips and there's the exhaustion of the time change and coming back home and all the things to do. And then there are piles and piles of mail and unanswered letters and unanswered phone messages and everything. So needless to say, it's a little bit overwhelming. And we had two opposite primary selves that dealt with them.
So she starts to work.
I go down into my office and I would start getting things organized.
And I do a little bit, you see, and not very much, because I don't want to get into that big rush thing. So I go more to this side to get us to stay away from the rush.
I go more to that side and try to do it faster so he won't notice that I'm rushing.
So maybe I go upstairs early and I'm reading in bed now, and I hope, well, who knows, maybe we'll make love, you know, it could always happen. And, however, I don't make my needs known, because a very interesting thing happens in bonding patterns. And one of the interesting things is that there's some way that my vulnerable son is happy to have her working mother take care of things. You see? Now that's quite an unconscious thing that goes on, you see? But somewhere that powerful mother makes him feel secure. So he just lets that go, and if I'm not conscious of that. I just let that happen.
And on an unconscious level, I pick that up energetically, that he's really happy that I'm doing it. And so that hardworking mother of mine just works harder and harder because she wants him to love her.
Okay. This is normal psychology, okay? It happens to all of us. There's no escaping it, okay? These bonding patterns are going on, but they're going on at an unconscious level. So what we want to learn how to do is to begin to hear the voices of these bonding patterns so we know what's happening in the interactions, okay? So now it's 9 o'clock or 9:30 and she's still downstairs working and I'm starting to shift over from sort of loving, needy, vulnerable son, introvert, spiritual, you know what I mean, all that together. I'm starting to shift over into what? Irritated father. Okay, so it shifts from the positive bonding pattern to the negative bonding pattern.
And I can sort of feel that downstairs.
You can feel it in Australia if you tune in. When we men go into negative fathers, we don't kid around. We know how to do that real good.
We're pretty good on negative mothers, actually. So I feel that.
And then I begin to really, get into judgment, and I say, Jesus Christ, I mean, it's all subliminal yet. It hasn't broken out between us, but, I'm just starting to get harder, and I get more contracted, and I get more withdrawn. So, 3 hours before, she had this very loving person with her, this human being.
Who says goodbye and it's nice you're working, basically.
And now, essentially, she comes upstairs at 10 o'clock or 10:30, and who's there? She's got Adolf Hitler there, you see? And I look at her, and I'm cold, withdrawn, and, and I say something like, I don't know why you have to, get everything done the first night, you just can't let things go, that nice judgmental, righteous voice, because in the negative bonding pattern, we know how to be righteous. We've nailed the other person in this crime against God, and we really go for it, because that's the characteristic of this negative bonding, that's righteousness.
And so I have a moment of feeling absolutely awful. And like, what have I done? And my first impulse is to work harder. And then I go into negative mother.
Well, she might go into rebel daughter first.
Yeah. So what happens is the angry father gets the rebel daughter. There's a moment of anguish, then the rebel daughter, and then the negative mother, who lets him know that if she had a little help, she wouldn't have to be doing it all by herself, and she wouldn't have to be worrying about it, and it might have been done already, or at least it would get through. But for God's sakes, how can you just relax when there's all this work to be done?
Okay, so
she also is right.
Oh yeah, negative mothers, they're good at righteousness also. It's not just us fathers. Okay? Now, the degree of power of these negative bonding patterns depends on the number of and the intensity of the disowned selves happening between the people. So for example, in this situation, what is my disowned self? My disowned self is the worker, the one that says, hey, I'm home, rolls up my sleeves, gets to work, doesn't complain, just starts to do what has to be done, and just does it. That's my disowned self in that situation. And her disowned self would be?
My disowned self is the one that can sit back and relax and not leap into a pile of work as soon as she sees it. So the part that could relax and enjoy being home and enjoy being with Hal, because my worker is not a sort of relationship person. My worker gets things done.
Okay, now the stronger my disowned self and the stronger her disowned self, the stronger will be the intensity of the negative bonding pattern. The more disowned selves we have operating between us, the more intense will be the negative bonding patterns. Okay? Now, these negative bonding patterns can destroy a relationship very quickly, because in these very intense negative bonding patterns, you say things come out of your mouth that you cannot believe. You know what I mean? They come out with such intensity and such viciousness and such murder, you can't believe that you're saying them. And you can't believe you're saying them the way that you say them. And this is when the most abusive, incidentally, this is when abusive behavior happens. Whether it's on a physical level or a psychological level, it happens in these negative bonding patterns. Okay? So just keep that in mind, that the intensity of the negativity is a function of the number of disowned selves involved and the
intensity.
valence.
Yeah,
the
the
valence,
intensity
of the
of the
disowned self.
Because as you start integrating the opposite, these are less intense. Where you're 100% opposite and there's 100% disowning, they're really bad.
And I have to integrate the part of me that says, okay, let's get to it. And she's got to integrate what I represent.
And basically, the underlying vulnerability are the piles of mail that we both have to deal with.
How are we going to handle this? You know, our secretary, our office manager already warned us. She said, I don't even want to tell you what's waiting for you. I don't even want to tell you. That's a nice way to...
Yeah, to start preparing us.
Start preparing us. Makes us feel real good, you know. That's When a man goes into a strong patriarchal father, it's very hard to get out of. You know what it's like? It's like being in a fairy tale and being abducted by the black sorcerer and being taken to that castle, because when I go into that negative patriarchy, I am so mean and I am so cold and I am so vicious, even if I don't say anything, you know what I mean? And it's very difficult to get out of that alone. Now, when I go into that, if Sidra goes into some kind of frightened, guilty daughter, then I'm like a dragon that grows heads. I go from 2 heads to 5 heads to 7 heads to 12 heads. I get worse and worse and worse. If she goes into a rebel daughter and attacking mother, then we can get into a horrid, horrid, horrid bonding pattern. Those are the kind that really can destroy marriages. But if she can recognize that I'm caught, and if she has an aware ego, and if she reacts to me with clarity, she really rescues me from that castle and takes me out of it and literally inducts me back into some kind of awareness.
So there's no point in actually trying to change a particular self to make the patriarchal father a kind, sweet, loving person?
No. That would be like trying to make a saber-toothed tiger into a brand newly born pussycat. Now, the patriarch is the patriarch. He's here forever in me. My separation from him may cause him to change to some extent, but he always has the capability, if the vulnerability is deep enough in a situation that comes up, he can always come back and kill.
Because a lot of people would want to, in these bonding patterns, want to change themselves, but the self they see that they are is perhaps incapable of changing.
Exactly. The self that you are is incapable of changing.
You can't change it.
All you can do is separate from it. It makes me think of a fairy tale. There's a fairy tale of an enchantress who can make either diamonds and pearls come out of your mouth every time you talk, or frogs and snakes. And the negative bonding pattern is like that, frogs and snakes. When you're in that self, it opens up its mouth, it can be really trying to change, and it's still frogs and snakes that come out. The self cannot change. My judgmental mother is going to judge him. All I can do is separate from her.
And get into aware ego.
And get into an aware ego.
Let's sum up the points so far. When you are in a primary self, you are out of touch with vulnerability, and this can lead to polarization in a relationship. When you disapprove of or attack another person, you are judging or attacking your own disowned self. There is no escaping bonding patterns, as they are operating at a subconscious level. The more disowned selves operating between two people, the more intense the bonding pattern. Intense bonding patterns can destroy a relationship very quickly.
That we recommend to people, to partners who live together, is we recommend regular business meetings. You know how at General Motors they have business meetings, every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. and Wednesday morning and Thursday morning, whatever. Well, as partners, you have to decide how often you need it. But we have business meetings. So at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning, we sit down at a table and we go over everything that needs to be done for the next week or for the next few days, and we plan it out. And what we have found is that if you don't do that, the business details of life eat you up alive. And they're with you when you go to bed at night, and they're with you when you wake up in the morning, and they're with you at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they're with you when you're making love, and they're with you all the time.
And the interesting thing is each person thinks he or she is carrying the entire thing. So if you don't have the business meetings, you're having this kind of double coverage, where at the business meetings you could just divvy it up, and it's clear who's responsible for what.
So now what we tend to do is really, more and more we view relationship as a joint venture. And it's a joint venture operation, and whatever it is that has to be done, it doesn't make any difference what aspect of our life it is. We sit down and as a joint venture we decide together, how are we going to handle this? Who's going to do this? Who's going to make these phone calls? What has to be done? Who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? And so forth and so on. And then that's what we do it. And then we schedule the next meeting so that we have a clear idea of when that's going to be. So that way of operating takes care of a lot.
It takes care of our vulnerability, and it makes things much more impersonal and objective.
But I wish I could guarantee you when we get home this time that we're not going to get into a bonding pattern.
I'm scared of all those
Anybody who
boxes.
guarantees you that they're not going to get into a bonding pattern does not understand bonding patterns.
Yeah, because people sometimes, they think that, oh yeah, we just say we still get into them to make people feel good. No, we don't. One still does.
I'm happy to say that as you work with these bonding patterns and you keep, you use the bonding pattern as a teacher, you begin to separate from them, and you begin to take advantage of these interactions and grab hold of the primary selves and unhook. And I'm happy to say that as time passes, you really, you're in fewer bonding patterns. When you get into them, you get out of them much more quickly. You're never out of them completely. I mean, I think that's a physical impossibility. It's a psychospiritual impossibility as long as you live in a physical body. And I'm not sure about afterwards. We'll let you know. Other question? Yes?
What happens if it's a group of people that are working together and there's more than two in a bonding pattern?
What happens if it's a group of people who are working together and there's more than two people in the bonding pattern? You have to you analyze it two at a time, but then you can add a third person. For example, let's think, for example, of a mother and father and a new baby. Okay, so the man and woman, let's say that they've been in a relatively positive bonding pattern. So let's look at how that looks there. Okay, so it's good father. We're assuming now no aware ego, no awareness. They really have everything feels good to them. So you've got good father to daughter, and you've got good mother to son. That doesn't mean there's not man and woman there also, but that's the nature of the bonding pattern. Now a child comes into that picture. Okay? What happens to the primary linkage in the bonding pattern? It goes, instead of from the mother to the son of the man, it goes from the mother side of woman to the baby. You see, the bonding pattern shifts.
So let's see, I'll put the man on this one.
Okay? When the bonding pattern shifts in the woman away from the man, away from the son side of the man, and goes to the child, to the new infant, what happens to the man? He's abandoned. Okay? You cannot believe how many marriages end at that moment. You cannot believe how many couples have said to us, my marriage ended when the first baby was born. And that's exactly how it happens, because what happens is the primary linkage shifts. And then if the man doesn't become conscious of that at some point, the man and the woman don't become conscious, the woman bonds more and more deeply to the child. The man may also have a bonding to the child, but at some point he wants contact with the wife. And if he doesn't get it for whatever reason, okay, he begins then to take his linkage someplace else. Where does the man take his linkage? He takes it to work. Linkage refers to the ability to energetically reach another person. When we talk about intimacy between two people, really, literally, we're talking about the ability of two people to energetically connect to each other. We refer to a person's vibes, or they have a very strong presence. They have a very strong feeling about them. All of those statements are basically statements about energetic connection and linkage.
Traditionally, what the husband has done, looking for that energetic closeness or linkage, is gone someplace else.
To another person?
So to another person, usually somebody at work, or gone to work and linked into the people that are involved in work and getting fed that way.
Or money.
Or money,
Or the office secretary.
Or the office secretary, and it makes perfect sense, because then he has to work harder, right? He has to work harder because he has a child at home, and he has to make more money, so he spends more time at the office where he feels fed.
So it's possible to link into other things, not just another person. So if you're withdrawn...
He can link into his computer and stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
You know, and then the energetic link is to the computer. But this much we can tell you. I mean, most marriages end with the first child.
In what sense?
That's what people tell you. They say, my marriage ended when our first child was born. Because they knew nothing about bonding patterns, they knew nothing about energetics, and they, just what Sidra described, the man never realized the degree to which the woman locked into the child. So he drifted away very, very slowly, very gradually, and gradually began the linkage. As he begins the linkage away...
Then she links in more intensely with the child because she feels abandoned. And she's got this wonderful, all-loving, unconditionally accepting creature at home who needs her desperately. And her linkage intensifies there, and then his linkage intensifies elsewhere. And there's a drifting apart. There doesn't have to be any negativity, just a drift.
Just a separation,
Just
because
a separation.
There's no reason to be there energetically for him anymore.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, as a man, okay, if I recognize this, if I'm tuned in enough to know that I'm missing something, I'm feeling abandoned, or I want sex. I mean, it's been a long time, and how long are you supposed to wait? 10 years? Or until he goes to college? I mean, what is going on here? So I'm not feeling very reasonable, which is probably a very healthy thing, because I may cause a fight, and I say, hey, what's going on here? You know, I mean, you know, we haven't had any personal intimacy now. It's been, you know, a long time, and... you know, I think it's time to stop playing mother. And I may not even be nice about it, but she gets mad at me, you know,
And we get mad at each other.
We wake up.
It shakes us up. It wakes us up. Because if everybody's being really polite and sensible about it, we will very politely and sensibly, and as a gentleman and a gentlewoman, drift apart under these circumstances and not even know it. And then if I, as the woman, look to him for a little attention, his gaze is someplace else, and his energetic linkage is someplace else.
Because there's a certain point in
already.
this process of separation where you get so far apart, where the linkage is so strong in other directions, you know, the mother with the child and the man with, you know, and of course this is a time that men often link to other women. And vice versa, but linked to other women. It doesn't have to be a sexual connection. You know, a lot of the real splits in relationship don't happen because the man has a physical affair. They happen because a man has an energetic linkage that becomes so deep and so profound, maybe with many different women, you see. But there's a certain point in that process where it's almost too late. You can't get the attention of the other person anymore.
What sort of reactions could a man come up with in that situation, apart from just feeling cut off? Could he go into a negative emotion? Could he do, what kind of things could one expect or see as warning signs?
Well, a negative emotion often happens as a wake-up call. That's one of the things that does happen.
And that's good rather than bad. You know, you have a tendency to think that's not fair. And as the woman, you think, oh my goodness, you know, I'm so burdened and now he's angry. But basically, it's a really good wake-up call. He might find that he's got to watch television all the time, that he has to do things to occupy himself. If he has any tendency to addictive behavior, the addictions may get stronger. He may find himself drinking more or eating more or smoking dope more. This addiction to computers, I mean, computers are wonderful. You can bury yourself in the internet for hours until you're so exhausted you fall asleep and you feel fine. So if you find addictive behavior building up, that would be a sign.
So here we have a situation where a child has come into the family and the family is split apart. What could it be if there was consciousness on either or both parties' side? What would happen in that situation?
Well, I'm happy to say that that does happen to more and more people. That's the good news. And the good news is that both people are aware of the need to work on the relationship. Both people are aware of the fact that there has to be intimacy. So there's a certain period of months, you know, with a child where that total bonding has to be there, or else God help the child. And then at a certain point, there has to be time created for the relationship. What happens when a woman goes into that mother place is that there's no time for the relationship anymore, because everything literally is child-oriented. So you begin then to make plans on how you're going to be together. You know, time to go out again, and time to make love, and to arrange time for that. Time for the relationship. The hardest thing in family systems, really and truly, is for men and women to plan consciously and creatively how to be with each other. But what happens in most families is that they become mom and dad in the family system, and their own relationship disappears. And that does not do the children any good.
Very frequently in male-female relationships, the husband has to make a fuss about pulling the wife away once in a while, either out of the house or just insisting on some kind of energetic linkage or some kind of physical activity between them, or some intimate time alone. But very frequently what happens is he doesn't feel entitled to do that. It feels not fair. So nobody feels as though it's their right to ask for that. And everybody, especially older children or husbands, feels that they're just supposed to get adapted to it. That it's the grown-up thing to do, and to defer to the younger child or to the new child.
Have you anything to say to mothers of today that has relevance to this whole issue of bonding patterns?
Well, yes, I do. As you get a sense of it, this positive bonding pattern can be very, very strong. And mothers today are taking their mothering very, very, very seriously. They're trying so hard to be the best mothers they possibly can be, because they're taking responsibility for everything about their child. And they have the sense if they make any mistakes, they're going to permanently ruin this creature's life. And it has the tendency to make the child a tyrant. That the child then gets to be entitled to everything. And we talked about the disowned selves that people carry for each other. Well, in this particular positive bonding pattern, the mother is not entitled to anything. She's not entitled to comfort. She has to be unselfish. She has to be giving. She has to be always available as a primary self.
She can't get angry.
She can't get angry. She can't get vindictive. She can't be selfish. She can't satisfy her own needs because the child's needs come first. then what does that leave for the child for primary selves? The child gets the ability to be entitled to have her needs taken care of or his needs taken care of, to be selfish, to be demanding. It has all the makings of making the child into a tyrannical primary self and the mother into a giving primary self. So I'd say watch it, step apart from that. The child needs this desperately, but have an aware ego that's a little bit separate from that mothering side so that you're not giving everything away all the time. As a mother, you have to start to separate from being a full-time mother, and you have to move back to yourself. Now, in the ideal system, you have an aware ego, and you're just bringing the nurturing mother in, the inner nurturing mother in. In actuality, you become her for a certain amount of time, and then at some time when it's appropriate, you separate from that. And you have the nurturing mother, and you have you as an aware ego separate from that. The child is not going to be 100% happy not to have this constant availability, and there'll be some upset coming back. If you're aware of this and you expect it, then you can treat the child with an understanding that that's what's happening, and you can maintain some kind of energetic connection even when you're separating from being constantly there physically.
So what happens to a child who is adopted out after a couple of days? What does that do to the energy system of the child?
I feel that it's a shock to the energy system of the child, but if the new mother can hold it and can bond into the child, then he or she has a mother.
One of the things that's very interesting is to realize that, for example, let's say a mother has to go back to work after 2 months or 3 months, really to support the family or for whatever reason. If the mother has proper linkage and understands what linkage is about, that has a number of consequences. First of all, she will choose the appropriate person to take care of the child, whether it be an individual or collective situation. She will smell proper linkage. She'll know who gives the child what it needs. Secondly, if she has a proper linkage to the child, she can be linked to the child even when she's not there, because this kind of connection between the mother and child goes beyond time and space. So literally the child can be fed by the mother in this way, even though the mother may also have to work.
When you say that a mother can be linked with her child even though the child is in another location, how does that work?
It does.
Well, it does work. I mean, let's approach that one first from the standpoint of two adults, you see. Mm-hmm. For example, if I'm in my study working and Sidra is in her study working, okay, if we're energetically connected, when we come back to each other physically, it's as though we've never been apart, because that connection is there. If she gets into a pusher, or if I get into a pusher, which I have been known to do a few 100 million times in my life, then what happens is very interesting, because the energetic linkage gets broken, it gets cut. So when I go into pusher and my linkage gets cut, she knows it.
I feel the loss in the next room.
She may get up and come into the room and see what's going on or something like that. She gets a sense that something is off.
And I can really feel that. A lot of people have that, if you're coming up the front drive, you can sort of feel what the mood of the house is before you go in.
So in some way we're connected energetically beyond the physical body.
Absolutely.
You are definitely connected beyond the physical body. And you've often first noticed that between a parent and child, or a mother and child. And a mother can really tune into a child from wherever she is. So if you're a mother and you keep that linkage from work, you're feeding the child. You could just think about the child once or twice and send it love. And, picture it and send it love, and you're staying connected. And the child feels that, and we adults feel that. If you're on a different continent, you can feel it. You can feel, we feel it very strongly with each other when one or the other of us goes off. I remember when I had a daughter living in Paris, I remember us driving down the Central Valley in California once, and I said to Hal, I have to stop and call her.
This is on Highway 5. There's nothing around for 2 million miles, you know, and just suddenly it was there.
And she was in
this
Paris,
was-
France?
She was
She
in
was in
Paris,
Paris.
France. She was a grown woman. And I said, I have to call her. And I got out of the car, telephoned her. She said, I just walked into the apartment. I was really lonesome, and I've just come back from being on a skiing trip. And how did you know to call? But those linkages, if they're there, you don't think about them, and they're not chains. They're invisible. You know, it's interesting. The kahunas in Hawaii have a word for it. They call them aka cords, and they see them as golden cords that stretch from one heart to another.
When we end a workshop that we do, the last act of the workshop is we ask people to take their energy back from us. So when they go home, they're in charge of their energy system, and they don't leave it with us. They don't cut the connection with us, you see. So consciously they pull back their energy so that they're in charge of the system again. Energy is the new education for Western man.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because we have been trained in Western education in a very materialistic way. We learn a body of knowledge that has been very, very helpful to us in many, many different ways. But the advent of consciousness is forcing a very new kind of educational process to take place. We have to learn about aware egos. We have to learn about dreams. We have to learn about bonding patterns. We have to learn about energy, because there is a whole world outside of our physical body that is happening, and that is the new education that is going to be occupying us for a long time to come.
Why is that? What effects will it bring to people's lives to know these things?
Well, for one thing, if you say to me, Hal, I love you, I would like to know if you mean it. Okay? If the energetic linkage isn't there when you say it, then those are just words. If the energetic linkage is there, then I know you mean it. In other words, this awareness of linkage gives us all kinds of information. If I am in the world and I am dealing with people who are very cold and impersonal and withdrawn, I have to know how to handle those people. How do I handle those people? I don't want to have to withdraw, so I have to learn how to bring up in myself energies that are impersonal and cool so I can match that. Then I can deal with them. If I'm dealing with somebody who's very open and personal and loving and caring, then I want to be able to bring that up and match that if I choose. So I want to learn to have control of the kinds of energies that I use so I can meet much more of the world and be in charge, take care of myself. I don't want to be the victim of other people's energies.
Let's sum up the points so far. Linkage means the ability to energetically connect with another person. Linkage goes beyond a physical body connection. You can experience linkage with people who are at a distance from you. To gain control of your energy system gives you the means to handle all types of people. Energetic linkage allows you to experience whether verbally expressed emotions such as I love you are truthfully felt by a person or not. Learning about the human energy system is the next work for humanity.
In the United States, we have a Congressional Medal of Honor for men in war who have done heroic deeds. Okay? I would give a triple Congressional Medal of Honor to every step-parent and stepchild in the world, because I think it's the most difficult thing in the world to work through, okay? Because I entered into a family where I'd raised two of my own children, and I had to then, move into a stepfather role with 3 daughters, 2 of whom had no interest in me whatsoever. and would have been very happy to see me fly to the moon forever. What I would say from my experience and other step-parents we've worked with is that as the outside person coming into that situation, you have to really develop your impersonal energy. And you have to really allow the stepchild to not love you. You see, the needier you are in terms of your need for the stepchild to love you in that role, the more they smell that, and the more they kill. If you can really learn about, because you have pretty personal energy, you know what I mean? You're wide open, and I can just see you just wanting to make that contact. That's what I did also. They killed me. It was Slaughterhouse-Five, you know what I mean? I had to learn to be impersonal, and I had to learn to be caring and loving from an impersonal place. It's a very different kind of relationship. Then I wasn't making a demand on them to love me, you see, but it wasn't negative. I mean, we had negative times till I got there, but basically that's what you need. So that impersonal energy in that kind of situation is very, very, in any step-parenting situation, you have to have a strong impersonal energy. If you don't have it, learn how to get it. Let me just mention another one of these really sweet little bonding patterns that has enormous consequences. Let's say a couple have a daughter. They're not getting along particularly. They don't do anything about it. They really don't even know they're not getting along. They're just, the marriage isn't working. They have a daughter. Maybe they have a son also. It's a second child. So what happens if two people living together don't have a proper intimacy? What happens to this linkage, the way the bonding goes? Goes to the children. Okay, so let's take it from the standpoint of the man. Okay, so his linkage goes to the daughter. Okay, that means really that this little girl grows up with the primary linkage that actually belonged with the mother, the primary linkage, and it literally attaches to the daughter. Okay. When a relationship isn't working, it's as though the two people aren't being fed. We have to be fed. The feeding in a relationship is really a kind of energetic feeding. It's that feeling of intimacy that you get from another person and a feeling of warmth that comes from them. That really goes into us and we feel good. We have to be fed in that way. So if we don't get fed by our partner, then we have to get fed someplace else. In this case, the man got fed by the daughter. So the actual father has in him a father side on the inside and a little boy side on the inside. Okay? The actual daughter, who's say 5 years old, has inside her an inner mother who knows how to take care of people and a little girl that needs to be taken care of. So what happens is that the man and the daughter go into a positive bonding pattern in which his inner father takes care of the little girl and his child, and at the same time, this mother, this big mother in this little girl, takes care of the little boy and the father because his needs aren't being met in the real relationship to his wife. So now we have a positive bonding pattern developing through the years between the father and daughter. They're very close to each other. They talk to each other. The real intimacy is there in that relationship. Sadly enough, the mother who isn't part of that distances herself from the daughter, very often without even knowing that that's happening, and very often turns negative to the daughter because the daughter and the father are locked into this interaction with each other.
And does that cut the mother out?
It cuts the mother out, yes, exactly. She, on her part, is going to be bonding someplace else because she also has to be fed. It may be with some group that she belongs to. It may be with her son. But it will be someplace that she also...
Maybe with another daughter.
Maybe with another daughter, where she links in strongly. Okay, now what happens when adolescence comes? Problems. The girl, her energetic linkage begins to shift. It goes to her peer group. She has girlfriends now, and she begins to spend time with her girlfriends. she begins to discover boys, and her linkage begins to go to boys. It's very subtle at first. What happens to the father? Abandoned. But he knows nothing about abandonment. He knows nothing about primary selves, right? He doesn't understand any of this. So as he begins to feel vulnerability and abandonment, he doesn't know he's feeling vulnerability and abandonment. So where does he go when he doesn't know that? Goes into negative father. It's exactly what happens. And one day she comes home at 10:30 instead of 9:30. And he says to her, "Where have you been?" And she says, "I was at my girlfriend's house." And he says, "You know, you're becoming a slut. You're becoming an absolute slut." And before you know it, toads and snakes are pouring out of his mouth. And 11, 12, 13 years of positive bonding pattern disintegrates in a moment. She doesn't know what happened. She hasn't committed a crime. But after she hears that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 times, she goes into rebellion.
So what was it that actually turned him to feel like this?
His vulnerability. His vulnerability was building inside him until it couldn't be handled anymore. Remember, he doesn't know about his vulnerability. So whenever you have deep vulnerability and you don't know about it, you always go into a power side to handle it because it's too painful. He couldn't say to her, "I'm jealous of your new life." He couldn't say to her, "I miss you so much. I want you to have a good life, but I just must tell you that I really miss you." He doesn't know how to do that. So he goes into the power side and attacks. Whenever you have an unconscious vulnerability, you have a very dangerous bedfellow, because this negative father patriarch is very, very close to that. So now you have a full-blown negative bonding pattern, and we could hope maybe they were lucky enough to seek help, in which case he would begin to deal with the marriage that he's never dealt with. Okay? Now, what is his vulnerability about? Well, number one, he feels abandoned. Okay? But there's another factor in his vulnerability. His daughter is now 14, and she's sexual. And maybe his own sexuality is stirred up. But he doesn't even know that his sexuality is being stirred up because that's not allowed. That's not forgivable. Okay? So this patriarch comes in to protect him against his own feelings of sexuality towards the daughter. You see? And that makes that patriarch much stronger because, remember, the patriarch has those rules about thou shalt not. And thou shalt not be sexual or feel sexual with your daughter as part of those rules. And we men haven't had much help with that problem other than killing those feelings.
Would a relationship with his wife that was working negate or not encourage to arise those feelings of sexuality with the daughter? If he was linked in with the wife?
If he were linked in with the wife, there might well be some sexual feeling, so that's normal. It's not an unnatural thing to have a sexual feeling towards your daughter. As men, we have to learn to realize that that's a part of living. And if you try to kill that, then you kill the relationship. I can't tell you how many women that we have seen at all ages who've said to us, "I had such a wonderful, wonderful relationship to my father. And then somehow, I don't know what happened, age of 14 or 15, or I was 10 or 11, it was all over. He never let me touch him again." That's a tragedy. And that's because men haven't learned how to accept and acknowledge their sexuality and be strong enough to be able to handle it and contain it, you see, and make it okay. So the amount of sexuality that he has in relationship to the daughter will be very, very diminished by a positive relationship to his partner. And without a positive relationship, the linkage on all levels will be much greater to the child.
And, and with a positive relationship, there's that feeling of the two of them looking at her growing up and saying, "My goodness, look at her. look at how sexy she's getting. And they're in it together. It's a different kind of an experience.
I see.
Hopefully, if everybody has sense, the mother and father realize they need help. It's not the daughter's problem. And they get the help they need and take the whole issue off of the daughter. But until they recognize that, the daughter becomes the identified family victim because of this bonding pattern shift.
So what happens, Hal, when this negative pattern occurs, he goes into his patriarch, the girl comes back and separates? Does that remain the case for the rest of the child's and the father's life?
That can take many, many different forms. Very often, this kind of pattern is the beginning of what can be a rebel daughter primary self developing in this child. And that can go with her for the rest of her life. I mean, she literally can go into a rebellion and lose the connection to her father and her mother and go out into the world forever and ever and ever in that rebel daughter.
And that would create her life experience.
That would be the script. That would be the script for her life experience until she would be able to come to grips with the other side. Now, let's say she gets married. She's still very much rebel daughter. Now, she might shift in marriage and she might go to the other side. So the man might marry this free-spirited rebel daughter and, 2 days after their marriage, she can end up suddenly becoming responsible mother and completely let go of the rebel daughter and be a totally conservative, responsible parent, just as she was raised, you see, and the man doesn't know what hit him between the eyes.
How does that work with the mother-son? How is that just...
Exact same thing.
Could you just quickly go through it?
Well, okay, so you want to run through it.
It's the
You're a
same
mother.
thing. I never had sons, but the same thing. The same thing would happen. The mother's son is he's her boy and he's her little man, and it's all wonderful. And then he starts to grow up and want to be with his buddies and his pals, and he starts becoming more boisterous, and he wants to stay out, and he doesn't always want to be with her, and he may get a girlfriend, and she starts feeling abandoned. Same way. And then she starts to judge him, and she starts to try to pull him back into being a little boy.
And then comes kill the mother time.
And then comes total
That's
kill the
difference.
mother.
That's when that kill the mother thing comes in, and look out. I mean,
And he turns into rebel son, angry father, and will accuse her of all kinds of things.
Can you give us any other examples of a bonding pattern that could happen?
well,
or
I was
anything?
thinking about money, because money brings up a lot of bonding patterns, and the one that jumps into my head is one that happened quite a while ago. This couple were out browsing on a Saturday afternoon, and she generally in the relationship had the tendency to be the more controlling mother that would clamp down as far as money and spending was concerned, and he was much more the spender. So they're walking around, and they pass a car agency that sells Porsches. Now, he had a very good car, and he was making payments in it, pretty substantial payments. Anyhow, he stood in front of that Porsche, and he said, "Gee, wouldn't it be nice to have a car like that?" She went into multi-convulsions, okay? I mean, she went ape. My God, we're spending $600 a month car payments now, and, I mean, on and on and on. He looks at her very wounded. "What is your problem?" All I said is, "Wouldn't it be nice if we could have a Porsche?" And she said, "Yes, but that's how it always starts," and da-da-da-da-da. And then he says, "Look," he says, "we're paying $600 a month now. I'll bet we could own that car. We'd have payments maybe of $800 a month or $900 a month. It'd be very, very little more. And, we'd own a Porsche." And again, she's going crazy. And now he gets angry and he says, "Listen," he said, "this is my money anyhow, okay? I make the money in the family, you don't earn a dime, and they are really off. The big guns are out. 125 millimeter nuclear warfare is going on at this point. Who was it in him that stood in front of that Porsche and said, wouldn't it be nice to have a Porsche? It was his little boy. There wasn't a man there. Certainly wasn't an aware ego. It was a little boy speaking to the mother.
In her.
In her. Which is a pattern they had all the time, where he would always be, wouldn't it be nice if? You see, wouldn't it be nice if? Because these bonding patterns are fascinating because they call to each other like sirens. So his little boy calls to her, come to me, negative mother, come to me. I need you, I need you. We haven't had a go-around for a week now. So he calls to her and whammo, she comes out full bore, okay? The vulnerability underneath that is he can't handle the pain and the discomfort of not having what he wants. You see? He doesn't have an aware ego that can look at the car and say, oh, God, I want that, and not be able to have it. Because he can't carry that pain. He can't live with that feeling. His son side, his inside son comes out and says, wouldn't it be nice if? She can't handle the vulnerability that and the terror that goes with payments. Because if she were in touch with her vulnerability, she might say, you know, I really, the idea of owing more money now is really frightening to me. I mean, I don't, you know. I mean, she could bring out that vulnerability in some way. So that's the underlying vulnerability for both of them. The disowned self, she's his total disowned self. He always is ready to, wouldn't it be nice if, and easily end up buying the car or whatever it is he wants, and she on her part is always the one that tightens the purse strings and says no and cuts. So she can't get in touch with her I want voice. He's identified with his I want, and she is identified with her no, 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 no. So they, once a week, religiously, would go through their ritual death battle on this bonding pattern alone.
How can you be sure when you meet someone in a relationship that, and you feel immediately attracted to them, that that person is in fact going to be conducive to an enjoyable experience?
If I were in that situation myself, I'll answer it that way, and I was a single person and dating, and I met someone, and I know what I know now, I would be very much interested in the ways that were alike and the ways that are different. In other words, I would look very much at the primary self systems of the other person and myself. I would look at the disowned selves. I also would make sure that no commitments were made whatsoever on any level until enough time had passed that I could see what was under the primary self system in the other person. That would be essential. If you jump too quickly in relationship, you're jumping into the primary self system. I'll tell you a very, very quick, funny story about that. A businessman, this is a couple that came to see us, businessman, very successful, high-powered, busy, goes to Hawaii once a year to one of the islands where he lets down and he shifts from his pusher primary self to his beach bum primary self. He's done that every year for 5-10 years. The last time he meets a woman who lives on the island of Kauai, and she is an absolute Kauai type, you know, soft, loving, caring, has a business there. They fall in love, and in that month they meet, fall in love, get married. The month is now over. They're just crazy about each other. They come back to his huge, super mega buck home in the Bay Area, and he goes to work. Goes back to the original primary self, And this poor woman did not know what hit her. He wasn't being mean. He was just being who he was 11 months out of the year. And she went crazy, filled with rage and disillusion and disappointment. But really it was very simple, you see. She was identified with the Kauaian primary self. And when he was there, he was that, and they met and were very vulnerable and so forth. When he went back to San Francisco, Kauai went underground. And he had no idea what was bothering her. He just was doing what he did. So in meeting somebody, you have to find out what's going on. What are the primary and disowned selves? How does the person respond when she's vulnerable or he's vulnerable? What's their predisposition? And I wouldn't even consider any sort of commitment until a very considerable amount of time had passed and one could really see. The other thing about time passing is you get a chance from the unconscious to see how your dreams are. Another important thing is, how does your child feel about the other person?
That's the inner child.
The inner child. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. The inner child, because you see, a lot of times we may fall in love with somebody, but the inner child, when you talk to the inner child, you'd be shocked at what the inner child might say about the person.
Because they feel differently often. They have the inner children tune in to something other than the primary selves. And they have a great deal of wisdom. The other thing to note is what we've been talking about, which is that you're very attracted to your disowned selves. And this is extraordinarily attractive in the beginning and far less attractive once you've been together for a while.
So the guy from, the high-powered guy from San Francisco who went to the Hawaiian island, who was attracting her? Was it his pusher, disowned self that felt strongly attracted to the open, cool, loving person that the woman was?
His primary self would have been attracted to this woman because she carried the opposite.
And she would have been attracted to his pusher?
And at some level, she would have been attracted to his pusher and not known it.
That's the work she would have had to do if she could do it. She would have to embrace her own pusher in order to be with him.
Because you don't, if she was attracted to somebody that powerful and that pushing, she must have that strong a pusher or a power underneath that's waiting to be released.
I know a divorce lawyer who said the most common remark he ever heard from people who got divorced was, "I never knew they were really like that underneath." Is this because the others arise?
Yes, absolutely, because you're dealing with primary selves, and all the disowned selves aren't part of the marriage. Very often in voice dialogue, we're talking to these disowned selves, and we say, well, apparently you were never at the marriage ceremony. You've never been part of the marriage. And this disowned self, that's right, I've never been there. Yeah.
The other thing that happens is when you fall in love and you're all excited and you're really attracted to somebody, your primary self may be asleep for a while, because everything is so delicious. And then your primary self only comes in when the vulnerability hits or discomfort hits or you're back at work or the first challenge arises.
So is it possible to find somebody who you can match all your selves to?
Our experience is that as you unhook from primary selves, you begin to pull into your orbit people in general and partners in particular that belong to you and that fit. We've just seen that happen so many times. And as long as you're living in primary selves, you keep attracting the same opposite types into the system over and over and over again.
And it may not be a really obvious opposite. We might both be pushers, and we don't notice that we're opposite in something else. And then that becomes the issue around which
because
we dance.
you often find people today who are both career people,
Right.
both pushers.
So they're both pushers, they're both career people, and then suddenly they find out one's warm and open and personal, and the other one is cool and impersonal. Or one is really an intuitive pusher, and the other one is an organized pusher. And then they splinter and they go into bonding patterns over those opposites. But the more we separate from the selves and the more we get into the space of an aware ego, as Hal said, the more we attract people that belong to us. And there's that sense of a harmony. The selves may not match, the bonding patterns we can guarantee are going to happen, but there's more of an underlying harmonic where there's a match.
Let's sum up the points so far. For a relationship between two people to work, they have to feel intimacy. In the beginning of a relationship, you are very attracted to your disowned selves in them, and far less attracted once you have been together for a while. Before committing to a relationship, you should be able to identify both yours and the other person's primary self system and have knowledge of what is underneath. It is also wise to check with your own inner children how they feel about the prospective partner. If you remain locked in your primary self system, it becomes the script for your life.